think Jerry is exactly right on this, and this might be a role for the National Academy to convene on a regular basis the broader community. You know, one thing that is true is that there are a lot of folks working on this. There are a lot of folks thinking about this, and I've sort of forced my way into a lot of these conversations, and they often don't have any idea about what anybody else is doing. And so we need to create opportunities and forums for that sharing to happen so that we can start to have these integrated conversations that brings everyone together, that we can perhaps someone else has already solved the problem that I'm struggling over. And I think that's really important. I did also want to say that Jerry's observation that the leadership has to come from the senior executive level. In the federal government, that's the White House. At the state level, be the governor's office, is really important. So FGTC has been around for a long time. They've actually done a lot of things, but they haven't always had the connection to the executive leadership to declare their activities a priority. So it hasn't been as integrated as it could have been, and it hasn't been as impactful as it could have been. So one of my biggest concerns is really that we just go off and do it because it's a good idea, but don't get anyone else to understand and say that it's also a good idea, so it just sort of runs on its own. And I think we're starting to see changes in that, but this is one of those where it's sustained. And then the last thing I would say is, Keith talked about staff level leadership, career level leadership. It's critical, but we've got to have career people who are willing to get up in front of people like me and tell me that you need to do this, right? That there's a different talent and skill associated with technical competence and then managerial leadership. And that managerial leadership has got to be there because people in my position, we're transient, right? We will be here for some period of time, and then you're going to have that conversation again and again and again. And so we need to have people in those positions to be able, who are not only able but willing to force themselves in and make people have this as a priority.
That's a fantastic point. I'd only point out a person like myself becomes really transient really fast if we don't have receptive.
Okay, a good point. A good point on which to suspend this conversation, and hopefully this is an ongoing conversation. And I'll come back at the very end and ask you for some very quick final comments. But in the meantime, let's open it up to the audience. Questions, Scott?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all the panelists for coming today. My name is Scott Cameron. I used to be in this space in several capacities. I'm now with Grant Thornton, as Jerry knows, working on the Geospatial Line of Business project. I want to point out that on an interagency basis, through the Geospatial Line of Business, we're moving toward creating sort of a consumer reports on geospatial data. There's been a lot of discussion of how do you know if you can trust data, how do you know if you can use data. Well, what we're doing, and EPA staff has been very critical in providing leadership within the line of business to make this happen. We're starting off by defining what a geospatial data life cycle might look like. From that, we're creating a maturity model around each stage in the life cycle. From the maturity model, we're creating a scorecard. From the scorecard, you can essentially create metadata that can be attached to the other metadata describing a federal geospatial data set. So we're piloting this at this point, but at some point you'll essentially be able to have consumer report type information on what it is you're about to buy, what it is you're about to borrow from a sister agency, and hopefully that will be helpful.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Did you want to
have a question?
I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, my question gets back to...
Could you identify yourself?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm Joe Fontenelle. I'm the Army GIO and the Director of the Army Geospatial Center. My question relates to the discussion about governance. It kind of bubbled up to the federal level. Should there be federal policy? Should there be federal governance about a geospatial enterprise at some level? And I think we heard some of the discussion that may be a bridge too far. But I am interested in understanding at the agency level what type of actions are being undertaken. At the Army level, we've gone to a position where we've developed an enterprise policy, where we've worked with the acquisition community to develop acquisition decision memorandums that kind of force some interoperability and communications issues. We've gone to standards, data models, been working very closely with the CIO of the Army in a common operating environment implementation across computing environments. So I believe at the agency level, it also may be a bridge too far, but it's a mark on the wall. So I'm kind of interested in understanding what you all are doing to move in a direction where we can have an enterprise approach, where we have data that's discoverable, that's shareable, and most importantly is usable.
I can start with that. So we've done a number of those things at EPA as well in terms of CIO issued policies, Administrator's Office issued policies and directives that really, in the geospatial community, the agency started with the issuance of A16 and the requirement to create metadata for all the geospatial data. So that was a hook that we had to go out and to build those policies and to build the procedures that support those policies. And over time, we developed a few. I've pushed back a little bit on revisiting the geospatial data policy at the agency and asked the broader question, shouldn't we have a data policy, and why are we doing something specific for geospatial? So we're currently working right now on looking at a broad data policy that will be very simple, but it's really about making it everybody's responsibility to share their data and to create, to stand up their data in ways that other people can access it and not make it a nice to have, but make it a requirement of being their, part of their job. But I recognize that CIO issued policies, Army culture is a lot different than EPA's culture, but I suppose you still have the same. It's very, very difficult to enforce a CIO directive at the EPA traditionally. I think the opportunity that we have in that regard at the agency is the constricting budgets as time goes on. Our CIO and CFO are now very tight with each other and starting to work together. And one of the things that I'm doing specifically with respect to geospatial investment is making it very clear what the core capabilities that I and my team are making available to the rest of the agency. And we're making rules in the budgeting process that if you reuse this, there's nothing you need to justify. It's taken care of, it's a capital, it's a paid for expense on somebody else's time. If you're going to do something on your own, you need to justify it, you need to go through the CPIC process, you need to do everything you need to do. So hopefully that will help to get a stick and a carrot in terms of people working with us.
So I think the first thing from our point of view is that the corporate culture is remarkably different, right? We're a very small agency. We're only about 1,200 people. We're all in one building. But the chairman started the Data Innovation Initiative, a holistic approach to looking at all of our data assets. And we, because of the nature of our organization, really look at our data assets as individual Paperwork Reduction Act filings. Right? So our PRA filings is our data assets. I think, I think our primary approach in that is not dissimilar than Jerry's. We shouldn't be thinking about our data assets as data assets and geospatial assets. It's data assets. And are they meeting the right business needs for the organization? And if not, then we should do away with them or change them so that they are. And every one of them should meet the minimum requirements of the Dublin Core, because we have to answer all of those questions. The whole notion of publication of that data is inordinately important, and moving to a faster time to market of that becomes part of our culture. But we haven't initiated significant policy changes in the organization that moves all of that forward, other than a couple of very, very high-profile data sets need to move in that direction. So that's basically it.
Anyone else?
We don't have a GIO, so we're working toward that. And I guess I would agree actually with what Jerry said, that CIO directives aren't helpful. in the sense that they're usually outside of the day-to-day operations of at least in our programs, and so they're not really read or understood, or decision makers aren't willing to devote resources just to conform to them. And so finding ways to make sure that those things actually have a link is really important. It's one of the reasons why I'm here, that we've decided internally that it's important that someone with a program line, and my line actually matrixes across all of our other programs, is engaged so that it has that programmatic hook that, so I go and convince my counterparts that this is something that's worth investing in and conforming to. And then also, I've been fortunate that we have some resources to bring to it, so that always gets people's attention as well.
Can I just say that in response to that, one of the things we've learned is that this can't belong in IT channels. It's not an IT problem. For the Army, it's a mission command problem. It's about facilitating decision making. So the policies that we've issued have come out through what would be the civilian equivalent of COO channels, as opposed to CIO channels.
So, and Joe, that's exactly where I was going to go with a comment to say two perspectives. First, you can't have this be an IT thing. Second, I know people like to say it's all about the data. I use the word very, very specifically, and that was content. Content isn't just data. It's also data about data. It's also information and other elements that are out there. I don't want to use a word like knowledge, because when you say knowledge, it means something specific to other people. But I use the word content very specifically, because content could be an application. Content could be actual data, a raster file. It could be a commercial image. It could be anything. It's content. And not all content's the same, and not all content has to be managed equally, which makes it a very difficult IT problem, which is why those two things have to, like I said about balance, you have to look at that. But the perspective that I always give everything that we look at is from a user's perspective. And it's not necessarily just from what my analysts might think, what a first responder might do, what a policy maker might do with the data. It's all of those things. So you can't. So when you're looking at this problem, and it makes it sound hard. It's not really hard. It's actually quite simple and easy when you decompose it into those elements. It's complicated, but it's not necessarily hard. And so we've got to drive the right investments. Likewise, not everything we do is a compelling requirement that needs to be invested in right now. And some things actually stage over time. Capacity management within an IT infrastructure that gets you to X. If I think at some point I'm going to need this much storage to do this project, well, that's in 10 years based on how I'm aggregating or looking at data today. That doesn't mean I need that much capacity right now today. And I've got to have agility in the acquisition process in order to maintain pace, which means when we look at budgets, we need to look at budgets through an optic of what do I have now and project those costs in the future. So I think it's a mix of all of those.
Let's, if we go to the back so that we're not neglecting the people in the very back. Yes, sir, back there.
My name's Chris Tucker.
Could you identify yourself, please?
My name's Chris Tucker. Oftentimes we think in Washington that we have the occasional crisis. But if you kind of look back at the last year or two, or even past 20, it's really, it's all about crisis with the occasional lull. And when the crises get big enough, we were using baseball analogy earlier, but it's a lot like 5-year-old soccer, where all the agencies kind of bunch ball around the crisis because everybody wants to be in the sun and wants to be helpful, et cetera, et cetera. But it promptly becomes a whole of government response, whether it's Gulf Water Horizon or the Mississippi overflowing or you name it. So, I mean, I appreciate a lot of the comments that we've had about, well, I can kind of do it one way inside my agency, but then a lot of these problems are interagency. But it begs the question, when on a regular basis, every year we have at least half a dozen whole of government responses that tend to be so major that they're kind of I'll call them national security oriented, but not necessarily led by DOD. You know, Mississippi and New Orleans going underwater is a national security issue. And the president cares and he wants to see it on his big board. And while EPA is able to get it on their big board, and FCC can get it on their big board, and NTA can get it on their big board, it's not necessarily going on President Obama's big board with all of your stuff mashed up. You know, that's kind of the whole of government integration thing that I'm interested in hearing you talk about, because in my observation of the Washington Post front page, that happens half a dozen times a year, and he cannot get everybody's stuff on his big board, period. Do you guys have any thoughts? That's the framing issue at that level. Do you have any thoughts?
Sure, a lot of them. I would say, first, the thing about the disaster, which is really different, and we talk about this a lot in our building, like a lot, that, you know, in a disaster, you do what you have to do, and you sort of throw away issues of authority and responsibility and accountability. It's all of us, right? And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work for all of us. And so disaster happens, everyone gets in the room, the rules are suspended, and we just make things happen. When that's over, the rules come back, right? So it's not, so the thing that we have to remember is that we don't operate with a set of rules about authority, accountability, and the concern that if something goes wrong in the normal course of business, there's less forgiveness that happens than if it goes wrong in the context of an emergency where you're just trying to get things done. And our challenge is to find a way to be comfortable with the consequences of being wrong, of having things go wrong when you have such, by having so many flexibilities in place, when you know that, you know, last Sunday for us, there's an expose in the Washington Post about things that we actually don't control, but you don't actually get to say when someone's going to call something a problem. And so in the regular environment, the rules of the game actually are incredibly constraining in allowing us to have the type of holistic response that you'd like. But we're actually trying to do this anyway by taking off little pieces. So I talked about our 4-agency collaboration, and if we can get the rules of the game to work in that context, maybe we can start adding others in. But the reality, the political reality, actually makes this incredibly difficult to do outside of an emergency context.
It's a really good question, and I think I'll put it in a couple of contexts. One, not every agency has a business process that cares about Deepwater Horizon or whatever X emergency is. I would say that every agency cares about the continuing resolution.
Which is another crisis.
Right? So the comment about mapping the budget, it's the crisis that has to happen. And it's the crisis that we have to be transparent on. And as public administrators, I think it's something that we have to do constantly. That being said, so let's put off the crisis and changing the rules for this crisis for point of view. I think the change we need to make is consume how we publish, which we tend to not do. We tend to think of the two differently. I have my business rules inside, and I'm going to do some IT or some geospatial or some business process, and I'm going to consume that, and then I'm going to publish. I think that's a huge mistake. I think we think about publishing so that the consumer can see that, and I build my internal applications off of the same publishing. And lo and behold, there's a boatload of really great standards, thank you, that allow us to do that, so that when I publish, my IT developers can consume and make that available for the chairman or for the internal wireline bureau and the White House. And I haven't duplicated effort. All I've done is one thing. I'm publishing lightweight things that I can consume. When we think about them in two different contexts, like we have been for years, then we're automatically creating cylinders of excellence.
we're beginning to get to the end of our time. I'm going to ask, I know there's some other questions, and Mark, you wanted to respond. I hope that you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions of the panelists after we're finished. We'll have some time to do that. And Mark, maybe you can weave your response into your final comments. What we want to do in these last few minutes is, I'm not going to try to summarize what's been a very rich discussion, but what I do want to do is identify a few points that strike me that it might be useful to carry away from the conversation, and also set the final stage to get your reactions to, if you choose to, in your last comments, which will be about 1 minute and 30 seconds to 2 minutes. So be thinking along those discipline lines. Just a few points. One, I was quite struck with the recurrence of the notion of purposeful leadership, both the leadership part and the purposeful part. At the Academy over the years, we placed a great deal of emphasis on the importance of identifying the public purpose at the outset of an exercise and trying to analyze what a problem might be in public management, public administration, governance. What are we really trying to achieve? What is the public purpose? The public purposes here have focused on security. Economic development, obviously, is a major theme in the administration's policy memo. Economic development as it relates to economic and environmental sustainability, community health, and access to opportunity and the like. But the key thing is, what are we trying to accomplish, and what does this really mean in terms of outcomes and results for citizens? And that's what it's all focusing on. That in turn leads to a second point, which has to do with what does that say about place-based policies and supportive technologies. And I was quite struck with Zob's point about how the administration is pursuing a demand-driven kind of an approach as opposed to a supply-driven approach. That is to say, demand-driven in that it is focusing on purpose. And of course, purpose here has to do with the substantive purposes, and it also is very much related to the purpose of keeping costs down, if not reducing costs, which is obviously a key theme in our country at the present time, and one that we simply have to pay attention to. And here is a great opportunity for these place-based approaches with the support of new technologies to be able to develop approaches which in fact are able to achieve public purpose, meet real citizen needs, and do it at a reduced cost. So there's a great opportunity there, it seems to me. And then the third key point, the processes and the instruments that we use to actually further develop and carry out these policies. And there two things that struck me were, one, that we need to think increasingly of all of these technologies as tools of management, not just as analysis and prediction and the like, but how do you manage on an ongoing basis? How can you use these things in real time, in real place, and to make things happen the way that we want to happen? And then the other is the importance of collaboration. Collaboration, ongoing conversation, to be able to work across these different boundaries, whether it's agency boundaries at the federal level, intergovernmental boundaries, intersectoral boundaries, professional boundaries of the technology people, the substance people, the procurement people, and the like. How do we get the people we need to get together into this ongoing collaboration to be able to deal with these real problems that simply don't fit very neatly in any one category? So with those few thoughts, let's have one final round. Mark, let's start with you, and we'll work back in the direction and place the burden of the final word on Raphael. Mark?
You said 30 seconds to a minute and a half?
One and a half to 2 minutes.
Billions of years ago, the Earth cooled. What struck me of this conversation, and I'm looking at this from a standards and industry perspective. I think the technologies are out there. I think the industry's done a great job in trying to appeal to the range of requirements for place-based decision-making. Fundamentally, though, I think from the OGC perspective and from standards in general, it's about eliminating the barriers so that ultimately it is a policy decision that you're affecting. That's the only trigger you need to pull. And if we can get ourselves to that level where that's simply a policy decision, then the level of urgency will define how quickly that policy trips in the favor of sharing. And so our goal, I think our motto is to create this collaborative public-private environment where we can discuss the issues of technology and information interoperability, create the standards, and allow leaders within government and business to be able just to limit the decision to policy. No other barriers. And I believe part of that exists today, and there are a lot of other challenges out there that we're working on. My request would be is that we continue to have a very open, fluid dialogue on what this collective community needs to do to create that level of interoperability.
And Scott looked right at me when he said 30 seconds to a minute and a half. I know I went over before, so I will be very brief. Summarize on one point, brevity is not my strong suit. Technologies as tools of management, something that Scott said that really resonated with me as a great summary of this. I think we're not lacking for technology. It's pretty clear. We are lacking for the great examples of the applied use of these technologies in the public policy framework. Governor O'Malley is a great example of somebody at the highest levels of our government who does use data to govern, who uses geographic data to govern, and holds his cabinet. I encourage people to go. They have open cabinet meetings where you can watch the state stat process take place in Maryland. The Kennedy School's written a very interesting case study on his use of that. I think that has to happen at the highest levels of government. I think it has to happen at the community engagement level too. And Mike's work with IssueMap and other things to get communities the data and the tools that they need to use geography to tell their story, to drive public policy, I think is the key. And I think the mistake that we've all made is that in past efforts is focusing on technology first. It's really focusing about those public policy use cases, and we've beaten that dead horse I think several times. So with that.
I'll make 3 points. Think where first, not last. It's extraordinarily important that where is part of the equation as we're designing systems, not just the questions. Second, we need to recognize Moore's Law. Thanks Steve, for bringing it up. So that we're building tools that others can build off of. I don't think there's any application that we've talked about here that is a domain solely of the agencies represented. We all need to consume each other's stuff, so that means that the publication and consumption has to be in one single vein. I would argue that single vein is HTTP. Nothing else. And 3, put everything in a spatial context. So everything has to be how much of this is compared to that in a similar place.
So, a couple seconds on the question that Chris asked about crisis. It's funny because I was thinking about March 15th. Some people saw me a couple weeks ago. I spoke. I talked about March 15th. Not recently, when we actually happened to be on the USS America on March 15th, 1986, when we bombed Libya. And it's funny how things change; they stay the same. Technology rapidly improved, but our ability to respond was quite different then than it is now. I look at that in terms of how that's translated in towards humanitarian support and crisis support. The distinction being, we practice a lot more. And I'd like to say, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And if you're not exercising muscles all the time, if you're not even just reaching out and making sure lines of communication to people that you need to interact with in a crisis are open, and that the dialogues are open, and people just know you're still there, how you react in a crisis is completely different. I just harken back to duck and cover drills and fire drills when I was a kid. The reason that you got fast at them is because you did them over and over and over again. And so you have to practice leadership. You have to practice crisis response. You do it in how you do things every day, day in and day out. And you don't draw a distinction between a staff meeting, a one-on-one interaction with people, or being on a panel like this, which was really my pleasure to do. Policies, I'd say, policies are like IT. It's all about process. You have to understand the process that a policy gets driven by and then make sure that the process is right. I think a lot of times we look at policies and governance and things like the FAR, and not understand the process in which they were developed, or consider ourselves not part of the process that needs to be there to develop the policy in the first place. All politics are local. I was just, when you were talking, just wrote, all politics are local everywhere, here and everywhere else. People are people and have core needs: food, shelter, water. I wrote beer. I don't know. and all of that happens somewhere, and it does relate to the other cultures and activities around them and how they react to one another. With regards to how this is all visualized and represented to people, deliveries have to be tangible. It has to mean something. You just can't put data. I've gone and looked at your content, your broadband maps, and I love it because it actually means something to me. I can look at my neighborhood and it actually means something to me. It has to be meaningful, it has to be tangible, and it has to resonate with who your target users are.
I'm going to say 9 things in 90 seconds. So I'd start with just some high-level principles that I think we all should keep in mind as we move forward about what is we're trying to, the character of what we're trying to produce. And innovation and openness as one. So there's been a lot of conversation about the openness. 2 is simplicity, and things that are easily and readily digestible. And 3 is flexibility. So we didn't talk as much about this, but in our domain, there are a lot of opportunity for people to ask, well, what if something, right? And we want to make sure that our systems are sufficiently flexible to permit the what ifs that we aren't actually thinking about at any given time. So those 3 things, I think, should be driving how we think about the infrastructure we put together. There are 3 other just basic issues. I think that as we proceed on this, we can never forget that technology does not equal policy or the use cases, and that we've got to actively work to put them together, that we've got to make those fit together in a direct way. Second thing is the cost basis. This is actually also a business proposition. So in my agency, we have multiple systems all basically doing the same thing that have been developed from scratch, each of them, right? That's craziness. And to the extent that you get better at that, you become a more efficient organization, and that has benefits. A third thing, which we haven't talked about very much at all, but I think is critical, I worry about this perhaps more than anything else, is that across our users, across the folks who want to use this, there's tremendous variation in capacity and capability. We deal with cities. There are some cities that have a lot of planners, a lot of GIS specialists. They could do anything. And then we have some who haven't done a general plan in 40 years. They're not going to have people out there that are just going to figure it out. And we're going to have to find ways to allow this technology to be equally applied, because those are the places and those are the people on some level who need it the most. Right? And so we need to flip that on its head and make it as accessible as possible. And then I want to close with just 3 points, 3 challenges to the public administration community, 3 things that that you might do to help advance us. The first is provide leadership on governance. The ideas about what best practices are, about what protocols make sense, about what data standards, really lifting this up for folks who aren't in the conversation right now so that it becomes a bigger issue. The second is to help create the community around place-based policy making. We talked about convening. There are many different communities out there that are all in their own little circles. Breaking down the boundaries and the barriers in those circles, I think, can produce tremendous benefits. And then the third is to lift up applied uses. So we talk a lot about pilots. We talk a lot about interesting, innovative things. One of the things I'm trying to do in my group is create an innovation of the day site, where every day a different innovation comes up, just so that you're putting stuff out there that might capture people. In this geospatial context, where we're talking about solving specific problems, I think there's real value in that to give people an idea what to do. And then the last thing, which I'm just adding, so it's just 10, is the playbook. So I think we've got to find ways to make it easy for communities to actually do this. Tell them exactly what they need to do. First you do this, next you do that, next you do this, so that when people think about, oh, this is neat, I'd love to have this, they actually have an action plan, and they don't have to feel like there's a huge barrier to entry to get these things integrated in.
Excellent summaries all. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you to the audience. Thanks to NAPA and to the staff and especially on the staff, Jonathan Tucker for pulling this all together. And that adjourns our session.